The gates of the Colosseum were still closed when the screams began. Beneath the marble seats of Rome's greatest arena, where senators and nobles would soon feast their eyes upon blood and spectacle, there were corridors of stone that no sunlight touched. The air was heavy with sweat and smoke, and the walls were carved with scratches from hands that would never see daylight again. Here, in the underbelly of Rome's glory, prisoners waited for the day that would decide whether they would die with a sword in their hand or as food for the beasts. And before the crowd ever cheered, before the drums ever sounded, Rome made sure they were broken in body and in spirit. This is the story the poets never wrote. The story of what happened before the arena decided their fate. The Roman Empire loved to call itself civilized. Its architecture reached the heavens, its laws shaped nations, and its emperors believed they were chosen by the gods. But beneath that perfection was a system that thrived on fear, control, and entertainment bought with human suffering. Gladiatorial games were not just contests of strength, they were rituals of dominance, designed to remind every Roman citizen that the empire's power over life and death was absolute. The prisoners who would fill those arenas came from every corner of the empire. Some were criminals, condemned for theft or rebellion. Others were slaves taken in war, men and women who had once been free, soldiers, farmers, even kings. Rome had a word for them: damnati ad mortem, the condemned to death. Their lives no longer belonged to them, they belonged to the spectacle. Their journey to the arena began long before the crowd ever saw them. Captured in foreign lands or sentenced in Roman courts, they were thrown into holding cells known as the carceres, small stone pits beneath the amphitheatres. The air was foul, the light dim, and the sound of chains constant. Guards mocked them, branding their skin with hot iron to mark them as property of the games. Those who had been noble or free were stripped naked, their titles erased, their names replaced with numbers. Before the day of the games, the prisoners were inspected by lanisti, the managers of the gladiator schools. Some would be trained briefly if they were to fight, but most were untrained. Their purpose was to die quickly, their deaths serving as entertainment between the more skilled bouts. The Romans called these people noxii, the expendables. They were criminals, rebels, and slaves whose only value was to amuse the crowd with their suffering. But Rome's cruelty was not content with simple death. The condemned were forced through rituals meant to humiliate and dehumanize them. They were paraded before the crowd days before the games, mocked by children, spat upon by merchants, cursed by the priests who claimed to bless their souls. In the prisons below, they were fed just enough to survive. Guards wagered on who would scream first in the arena, who would try to run, who would beg for mercy. The smell of blood and filth never left the corridors. For those chosen to fight as gladiators, a different fate awaited. They were sent to the ludi, the training schools, where discipline was as cruel as the games themselves. Here they learned to kill efficiently, not to win freedom but to make the crowd roar. Some prisoners prayed for death before ever reaching the sands. Others clung to hope, dreaming that victory might earn them a pardon, a rudis, the wooden sword that symbolized freedom. But the truth was far darker. Rome rarely gave freedom to those who entertained it best. It needed them alive, just long enough to die when the crowd demanded it. On the night before the games, the prisons beneath the arena were filled with noise. The condemned whispered prayers to gods who had long abandoned them. Some tried to claw their way out. Others sat silently, staring at the torches that flickered on the walls. The guards drank, laughed, and told stories of what the next day's show would bring. Above them, the city slept, dreaming of blood and glory. When dawn came, horns echoed across Rome. The people filled the streets, eager for the spectacle. Vendors sold wine and roasted meat near the gates. Senators arrived in their robes, nobles brought their wives, and the emperor took his seat beneath a golden canopy. But below all that splendor, the prisoners were being prepared. Their chains were removed, their bodies washed, not out of kindness, but because Rome demanded beauty in its violence. Executioners rubbed oil on their skin to make the sunlight shine upon them as they died. They were dressed in rags meant to mock heroes of old, some as mythical villains, others as beasts, their deaths meant to imitate stories from legend. Rome turned mythology into murder, art into agony. For the prisoners chosen to face wild animals, the torment was worse. They were starved for days to weaken their strength. Some were wounded deliberately so they would bleed faster. When the gates opened and the lions and leopards were released, the prisoners were already half dead. The crowd cheered not for justice, but for cruelty, dressed as entertainment. The Roman philosopher Seneca, who lived through the games, once wrote that even the mildest citizens became beasts when the blood began to flow. He said that Rome's thirst for death was endless, that once the crowd tasted it, they could not stop. It was not enough to watch men die, they needed to see them suffer. In those moments before the games began, when the prisoners were lined up before the arena gates, some fell to their knees and kissed the ground. Others cursed their captors. Some laughed, their minds already broken. And when the iron doors opened and sunlight spilled into the darkness, they stepped forward into the roar of 50,000 voices, knowing that their deaths were no longer their own. The roar of the crowd was like thunder rolling through marble. As the sun climbed higher above the Colosseum, its light poured into the arena like a blessing from cruel gods, illuminating the sands where blood had already dried from earlier shows. The spectators were restless, their eyes bright with hunger, their cheers echoing off the stone like waves in a storm. Beneath their feet, in the dark chambers where the prisoners waited, that sound was not excitement, it was the voice of doom. The prisoners could hear every drumbeat, every horn, every name the announcers called. For some, it was the sound of minutes slipping away before death. For others, it was the last proof that Rome still saw them as something less than human. The air below the arena was thick with smoke from torches and the sour scent of fear. Guards walked the corridors, striking the bars of the cells with their spears to remind the condemned that their moment was near. In those last hours, Rome's prisoners endured a ritual of terror, unlike any the empire's laws recorded. Some were forced to kneel before the executioners and recite prayers to the emperor, declaring loyalty even as their death was assured. Others were mocked by priests who sprinkled them with salt water and told them their souls would be pure for the afterlife if they died well. To Rome, even piety had become a spectacle. When the gates to the arena finally opened, the blinding sunlight hit their faces like fire. The sand was hot beneath their feet, the air thick with the smell of wine, perfume, and blood. Tens of thousands watched from above, men who owned slaves, women draped in silk, children holding sweet cakes in their hands, all waiting for the moment when life would end for those beneath them. The prisoners were paraded across the arena floor to the emperor's podium. They were forced to raise their hands and shout the infamous words that still echo across time. Ave Caesar, morituri te salutant. Hail Caesar, those who are about to die salute you. And the emperor, seated beneath golden banners, would simply nod. Sometimes he smiled, sometimes he turned away. For to Rome this was justice, a public reminder of what happened to those who defied its will. The first executions were often the cruelest. Prisoners condemned as traitors were burned alive or crucified before the crowd as warm-up spectacles for the games to come. The people laughed, drank, and applauded, believing they were witnessing divine punishment. Those chosen to face the beasts, lions, tigers, bears, and leopards starved for days were led to wooden platforms scattered around the arena. The cages opened and chaos began. The animals lunged, the sand turned red, and the crowd rose to its feet. The victims' screams were drowned by cheers. Musicians played flutes and drums to keep rhythm with the violence. The entire event was choreographed, timed, and orchestrated like theatre. Rome had perfected the art of turning death into entertainment. But there was a crueler twist to the fate of certain prisoners. Some were dressed as characters from Roman mythology, condemned to die in ways that mimicked ancient tales. A man might be cast as Orpheus, torn apart by wild animals for daring to charm them with music. Another might be Prometheus, chained while vultures feasted on his flesh. The myths that once taught virtue were now rewritten as instruments of death. Those few who survived the beasts were rarely allowed to live. The games were designed to end all things. No unfinished stories, no escape. The survivors were executed by sword or forced to fight one another until the last man fell. On rare occasions, if a prisoner fought bravely enough or entertained the crowd with enough spectacle, the emperor could raise his thumb to spare them. But mercy in Rome was not kindness, it was calculation. To show mercy was to remind the audience that power, like blood, flowed from the emperor's will alone. After the games, when the crowds departed and the torches dimmed, the arena fell silent again. The prisoners who had died were stripped of their armour and jewellery. Their bodies were dragged through side gates and thrown into pits outside the city walls. Dogs and vultures fed on what remained. The sands were raked smooth for the next day's show, and the smell of death was masked with incense. Rome would sleep well that night, its citizens satisfied that order and entertainment had been preserved. Yet among the few who worked beneath the Colosseum, the slaves who cleaned the blood, the handlers who fed the beasts, the guards who dragged away the corpses, whispers began to spread. Some said they saw ghosts wandering the tunnels, the souls of those who had died unjustly, crying for vengeance. Others said that at night, when the arena was empty, they could still hear the faint echo of those words, Ave Caesar, morituri te salutant, spoken not in salute, but in defiance. The Colosseum became the heart of Rome's contradictions. To the world, it was proof of civilization, the greatest amphitheatre ever built, a marvel of architecture and engineering. But to those who walked its underworld, it was hell, carved from stone, a place where power dressed itself as entertainment, and humanity was stripped away with the same precision as a gladiator's blade. The philosophers of the time, men like Seneca and Cicero, wrote of these games with unease. Seneca warned that those who took pleasure in watching others suffer would lose their own souls. He called the arena a mirror of Rome's decay, a reflection of an empire that had forgotten mercy, but his words were whispers against the roar of 50,000 voices. Rome's people did not want reflection, they wanted distraction. And so the empire continued year after year, feeding its citizens with bread and blood. The games grew larger, the beasts more exotic, the executions more elaborate. Emperors like Titus, Commodus, and Domitian turned cruelty into policy. They claimed it kept the peace, that the spectacle reminded the people of Rome's strength. In truth, it reminded them of Rome's fear of rebellion, fear of weakness, fear that one day the empire itself might face its own arena. By the time the last games were held centuries later, Rome was a shadow of what it had been. The Colosseum, once filled with life and death, stood empty. Grass grew between its stones, and the echo of cheers faded into history. But its legacy remained, a monument not only to Rome's greatness, but to its capacity for horror. The prisoners whose names were never recorded, whose bodies were lost to the earth, became the silent testimony of what happens when power forgets compassion. Their suffering was Rome's entertainment, but their memory became its judgment. And perhaps that is the lesson the Colosseum still whispers today, that every empire which glorifies cruelty builds its own cage, and every spectacle of domination becomes a prophecy of downfall. If this story has opened your eyes to the darker heart of ancient Rome, if it made you see beyond the marble into the shadows where humanity was traded for applause, then subscribe to the channel and like this video, because history's greatest empires did not fall by the sword, they fell by forgetting what it meant to be human.